Good morning. I am pleased to welcome you at the Phoenicia. The name of our venue evokes the legacy of those who were, according to a Homeric scholion, the first to plow the seas. That's the formulation. As early as around the 8th century BC, the Phoenicians had made Malta a base of their trade in the Mediterranean. Herodotus even claims that they had ventured into the waters beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what is now called Gibraltar. Fast forward to the 20th century, it was here in this very building where on the 20th of September 1964, Prime Minister Dr. George Borg-Olivier hosted a state banquet on the eve of Malta's declaration of independence. And it was off the coast of Malta, not far from here where we are, where in December 1989, the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union accommodated on their warships, namely the Soviet missile cruiser Slava and USS Belknap, anchored in the choppy waters of Marshalloc, informally declared the end of the Cold War. Few still remember the solemn words of General Secretary Gorbachev at a joint press conference with President Bush on board the Maxim Gorky in the calmer waters inside of Marshalloc port. He said, I quote, "The world is leaving one epoch and entering another. We are at the beginning of a long road to a lasting, peaceful era," end quote. As member of the Mediterranean Peace Committee and at the invitation of Malta's former Prime Minister, Dr. Carmelo Mifsud Bonici, the International Progress Organization was taking part here in Malta on the 2nd and 3rd December 1989 in a meeting of peace advocates that coincided with the Superpower Summit. Unfortunately, the optimism and enthusiasm about the new world order the two leaders had displayed at their, as I vividly recall, storm-lashed meeting in the Mediterranean could not be sustained. The march on the long road envisioned by Gorbachev was quickly interrupted by a series of unilateral assertions of power in the 1990s already. This brings me to the challenges before us right at this moment. What kind of maritime order can evolve in a geopolitical environment where Cold War bipolarity has vanished, but an even more complex and pervasive struggle for global dominance unfolds, in which the oceans increasingly become a theater of competition? A new concert of powers seems to emerge, indeed a kind of 21st century maritime version of the great game, where, as in the 19th century, the unilateralism of the national interest, as I would call it, prevails. This has become obvious in a new rush for the resources of the ocean that ignores the provisions of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The open challenge to the International Seabed Authority, ISA, by the US President's executive order of the 24th of April this year, entitled Unleashing America's Offshore Critical Minerals and Resources, is a case in point. The bellicose language of the executive order betrays the real motive. It was the earlier mentioned first Prime Minister of independent Malta who early on warned of such unilateral action driven by the greed under the cover of vital national interests of powerful countries. In his speech at the plenary meeting of the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 6th of October 1967, Dr. Borg-Olivier spoke about the consequences that could have resulted from the 1958 Convention on the Continental Shelf, which was then in force, and which defined the limits of the continental shelf in terms of a country's technological ability to exploit. Introducing consideration of the common good of humanity into the discourse on maritime affairs, the Prime Minister lucidly explained what this open-ended instrument, as he called the 1958 Convention, would imply for the exploration and exploitation of the resources of the oceans. And I quote from his speech: "The formulation of this convention might result in technologically advanced countries claiming to appropriate for their own exclusive benefit the seabed underlying the sea at any depth and at any distance from their coasts, as soon as they can exploit the natural resources thereof." End quote. He suggested, and I again quote from his speech, "the establishment of an international agency to assume jurisdiction as trustee for mankind over the seabed and ocean floor in order to ensure their orderly and rational exploitation, and that from the immense potential of the exploitation, the poor countries should also benefit." End quote. Also, the Prime Minister called for an equitable solution to conflicting national claims. This was many years before brakes were put on to the Geneva Convention's open-ended approach through the definition of the continental shelf under UNCLOS. Similarly, Malta's first permanent representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Arvid Pardo, in his seminal and far-reaching speech at the first committee of the UN General Assembly on 1st November 1967, spoke of, and I quote, "the intolerable injustice that would reserve the plurality of the world's resources for the exclusive benefit of less than a handful of nations." End quote. He warned of what he called a competitive scramble for sovereign rights over the land underlying the world's seas and oceans, surpassing in magnitude and its implications last century's colonial scramble for territory in Asia and Africa. These were his words at the UN First Committee. Thus, one could say, Malta was an early trendsetter in raising awareness for responsible ocean governance, emphasizing the shared responsibility of states, and Pardo laid out the elements of such a just maritime order. He introduced into UN phraseology the notion of the high seas as common heritage of all mankind. These were his words, common heritage of all mankind. Quoting from a resolution that had been adopted by the World Peace Through Law Conference earlier that year, 1967, in Geneva. Not least because of Pardo's indefatigable efforts as communicator of their message, of the message of these 2,000 lawyers within the UN system. Article 136 of UNCLOS now reads, and we all are aware of that, the area and its resources are the common heritage of mankind. That's Article 136. In view of his pioneering role in calling for a regime of the oceans that transcends the greed of the nation state and incorporates a new paradigm beyond the essentially utilitarian approach, resembling the mindset of colonial exploitation of the 1958 Geneva Convention, we would like to pay tribute to Arvid Pardo and dedicate our meeting to his memory. We equally remember today the monumental and historical role of Elisabeth Mann Borghese. Together with Ambassador Pardo, she raised global public awareness for ocean governance that protects the environment and resources of the sea for future generations. As initiator of the Pacem in Maribus conferences and founder of the International Ocean Institute, now headquartered in Malta, Elisabeth Mann created a legacy of scholarship and civil responsibility, as one could say, in rebus maritimis, to keep with the Latin title of her conference series. Today, more than 3 decades after UNCLOS entered into force, it remains to be seen how the principle of common heritage introduced by Pardo can eventually be preserved in a climate that is increasingly one of global anarchy, in the wake of the obvious failure of a hastily proclaimed rules-based order. Under evolving global conditions, an even greater challenge will be how to develop the common heritage principle further towards the notion of common good of humanity. A subtle, implicit hint at the idea, in my reading, may be found in Article 59 of UNCLOS, which states that parties involved in conflicts over rights and jurisdiction in the exclusive economic zone also must take into account, and I quote, the importance of the interests involved to the international community as a whole, end quote. It will not anymore be sufficient to think just of how to equally share resources. The overriding consideration must be how to use them responsibly in view of common survival. Increasing environmental threats that affect not only low-lying islands, but ultimately and at various degrees the entire international community, leave us no other choice. This concern is also reflected in the BBNJ agreement that will soon enter into force, and where the parties state that they desire, quote, to act as stewards of the ocean in areas beyond national jurisdiction on behalf of present and future generations. And in concluding, I would like to mention some of the other major challenges of maritime order under UNCLOS. As the Convention can only be fully implemented through arbitration and court rulings, one must ask how state parties should deal in the global constellation of today with fellow state parties that simply ignore the rulings and awards because they feel that they do not need to fear the consequences. This is indeed a major challenge to the international rule of law. Rules without enforcement are not legal norms in the strict sense. That's what we have learned from Hans Kelsen's theory of pure law. They more resemble non-committal wishes or moral principles. Also, the community of states parties is faced with the question as to how to deal with the fact that some countries are not parties to UNCLOS. The most powerful among those few states is obviously, as we see now, is obviously not impressed by the opinio juris that UNCLOS, or basic provisions of it, has now, or has by now, acquired the status of customary international law. The open contempt for the ISA displayed by the United States is a case in point. Another serious issue for the maritime rule of law is how to deal with armed, at times even lethal attacks against, with sabotage or with abduction of civilian and in particular humanitarian vessels and their crews by states in waters beyond their territorial jurisdiction, including in the exclusive economic zone of other states. And it will be very interesting to see now what follows from the order of the Italian Navy to protect the humanitarian flotilla, which is now on its way in the Mediterranean, from armed attacks. One ship has been ordered to protect that flotilla. The protracted armed conflicts in the Black Sea and Eastern Mediterranean regions and recent incidents in the Caribbean Sea have made the wider public aware of what is at stake when parties to a dispute interfere with the freedom of navigation or obstruct, as we see now, humanitarian missions by means that may include the use of military force. I would say there must be no vigilante justice on the high seas. Lastly, among the major challenges to maritime order is the assertion of sovereign rights over sea space on the basis of claims often rooted in colonial history to territorial sovereignty over distant islands and the unilateral assertion in the area, beyond national jurisdiction area with capital A, of a state's national interests at the expense of the interests of all other states. In view of all of this, and against the background of deepening geopolitical instability and uncertainty, Elisabeth Mann's vision of Pax in Maribus and Arvid Pardo's notion of the high seas as common heritage of mankind remain as relevant as ever, as a reminder to the conscience of nations. And with this, I thank you for having accepted our invitation to come here to Malta, and I look forward to our discussions.